One of the first apps that I wanted to build when I started learning how to develop iPhone, which was just a few weeks ago, was an app that had a tab bar at the bottom, a navigation bar at the top, and a table view. And a lot of iPhone apps seem to use this app structure. So I tried to build it, and I really struggled with figuring out how to do it. And eventually, with some help from some really nice folks on the Cocoa Dev mailing list, I figured it out. And I thought I'd make a quick screencast to record what I learned and hopefully help somebody else who might be struggling with the same thing. So I'm going to show you by example, by building an example, how to create an app with a tab bar, a navigation bar, and a Tableview controller. And the app that I'm going to build in this example is just a very simple app that will show two tabs. One will have a list of books in a table view, and one will just be a simple about view that shows a little information about the app. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new project, and I'm going to select a window-based application as my template, and I'm going to call this project OR Books for O'Reilly Books. And since I already know that I want a UI tab bar controller as the root controller, I'm going to go ahead and create an outlet for that in my app delegate, and then go back into Interface Builder to set it up. And this is one mistake I made when I first started developing this app, was I didn't realize that the tab bar controller had to be the root controller. I thought the navigation controller did. So when you're doing it, just make sure that you create the tab bar controller first and then put the nav controller inside that. So open up the app delegate, and we're going to add the reference to the tab bar controller here as an IB outlet. So I'll go ahead and create the IB outlet for tab bar controller. I'm going to call it the root controller, and I'll go ahead and create a property for that as well. Okay, then jump over to the implementation and synthesize your root controller. I always jump in and release it while I'm thinking about it so I don't forget. And then we want the tab bar controller to be the first view we see when the application launches, so we'll go ahead and set this up in the window as the view. Okay, now that we've done that, we can jump over to Interface Builder by opening main.window.nib file and get that set up in the Interface Builder. Okay, so I've got Interface Builder open here with main.window.nib file, and the first thing we can do is we can drag in a tab bar controller right into our main window. This creates a new view, which is our tab bar controller, and we no longer need this window, so I'm just going to close that and get that out of the way. First thing I'm going to do is hook up the reference that we created in the app delegate to the tab bar controller. Make sure that's set up, and then I'm going to go ahead and add the images to the tabs. I've already got 3 images set up that I want to use in a folder inside my project. A book icon, which is going to go into the first tab, an icon settings, which is going to go into the second tab, and a default image that will load when the application is loading, or will be displayed when the application is loading. So to get these into my project, all I have to do is drag them into Xcode. So we'll switch back to Xcode really quick. Drag them into the resources folder. Oops, there we go. And I don't need to copy because they're already in an images folder in my project. So I'm just going to add those. So those are available now for use in Interface Builder. So I'm going to switch back to Interface Builder and select the first tab, and I'm going to set this to the book icon, and I'm going to give it the title, Books. So we now have set the image and the title for the first tab. Do the same thing for the second tab by selecting the image, selecting the settings icon and changing the title to About. Now expand the tab bar controller and you will see under here that we have two view controllers already set up with the tab bar items appropriately set as they should be, because we're using the tab bar controller as our root view controller. This first view controller is going to be associated with the Books tab, and the second view controller is going to be associated with the About tab. What we need to do, however, is create classes for these and set the classes appropriately in IB. So what kind of classes do we want for these view controllers? For the Books tab, we're going to have, this is where our navigation controller comes into play, because we're going to have a table view here, a navigation bar at the top, and then when you click on a table view item, it'll take you to another view, but the navigation bar will stay at the top and allow you to switch back and forth. The About tab is just going to have a very simple view controller with some about information. So let's do that one first, since that's the easiest one. So jump back to Xcode and create a new class called About. And we're just going to create this as a UI view controller subclass, since it's going to be a simple view, and call this About View Controller. Now we need to create a nib file for the About view as well, so we go in and create a new file, and this time we select User Interfaces and we select View Nib here. And we're going to call this About View. Okay, great. That's all we need to do in Xcode. Now we need to open up the About view in Interface Builder and set it up how we want it. So double click on the About view and we get our About view window. And the first thing we need to do here is set the size of this so that it'll fit above the tab bar, because the tab bar will still be visible when we switch to the About view. So we want to change the height of this view to 411 from 480. So you can see it'll fit nicely underneath the status bar and above the tab bar. The next thing we need to do is set the class of the file's owner to About View Controller. And then we need to set the view outlet to point to the view, since we're setting this up manually. Now, let's add a way to view text on the About view. So I'll switch over to Data Views and I'm going to drag a text item, text view onto the view, and I'm going to change the text to something about the application. Okay, we're done with that view, so close that. And now what we need to do is tell the tab bar controller about that view. We need to tell it to load the About view when you click on the About tab. So the first thing we do is we set the type of the controller associated with the About tab to our About View controller. Then what we need to do is we need to tell it what nib to load. So we tell it to load the About View nib. And you can see this changes in here to indicate that it knows to load the About View nib when you click on the About tab. Click on the tab bar controller and notice when I'm in the Attributes Inspector, it's got a View Controllers property here that has some information about the class of the two view controllers associated with the two views. And currently they're set to View Controller. For the About tab, that's correct. The other choices are Navigation Controller, Table View, and Image Picker, and those aren't what we want. We want View Controller. When we come back and do the Books View Controller, we're going to switch that to Navigation Controller. But for now, just leave it as is. You can save at this point and give it a try. So we'll switch back to Xcode, Build and Go, and we should see our About view. When we click on the About tab, and we do. Great, so it's working. So now it's time to create and hook up the navigation and table view controllers for the Books tab. So what do we need to do? Well, we first need to create a navigation controller, and then we're going to hook up the tab view for the first tab to the navigation controller. Then we're going to create a table view controller and hook up the navigation controller view to that. So first, let's create the navigation controller. So we create a new file, and we're going to select a UI View Controller subclass, and we'll call it Books Nav Controller. As you can see, the type of Books Nav Controller is UI View Controller, of course, so we're going to change that to Navigation Controller. And then once we've done that, let's go ahead and make a reference to the nav controller in our app delegate. So I'm going to create an IB outlet to a Books Nav Controller, and we're going to call this Books Nav Controller. And since we're referencing this class, we need to put a class reference up here. And I'm going to go ahead and create a property for that as well. Since I will need that later. Now we need to use it within the app delegate. So I'm going to synthesize the Books Nav Controller here. And I'm going to go ahead and release it while I'm thinking about it. And I want to make sure and import it so we don't get any compile time errors. Okay, while we're in Xcode, let's go ahead and create our UI Tableview Controller as well. So we create a new file, and this time I'm going to create a UI Tableview Controller subclass, so we can use that to manage our table view, and I'm going to call this the Books Table View Controller. And I'm going to go ahead and make this table view controller the delegate and the data source for the table view as well. And of course we need to give this a table view to manage, so we'll create the table view. Okay, we'll come back later to add the data source and delegate methods. So for now, let's switch over to Interface Builder and start hooking everything up. So you want to open mainwindow.nib, which should still be open. So now that we're back in mainwindow.nib, the first thing we want to do is set the type of the Books tab, the view controller associated with it, to a navigation controller. And when you do that, you will see the navigation bar appear at the top. Then what you want to do is select the navigation controller associated with that tab and make sure that the type is set to our Books Nav controller that we just set up in Xcode. Next, what you want to do is select the view controller that now appeared beneath the nav controller, because the nav controller has its own view, and you want to set that to be the Books Table View controller that we set up before. Then make sure that you connect the outlet in the app delegate for the Books Nav controller to the navigation controller in the nib file here. Alright, now again we should be able to build and go and see our new view. And it works. When we're selected the Books tab, we see our nav bar at the top, and we see the table view in the middle, or the table view controller. We actually haven't placed a table view in there yet. So let's quit the simulator and go back to Xcode, and what we need to do now is create a view for the table view that's associated with the table view controller. So we need to create this view. So click on Resources and add a new file and create a user interface, a view nib, and call it the Book View. Actually, I think I'm going to change the name to Book Table View. Open this nib file. And just like before, we need to resize this view so it's going to fit into the view portion between the navigation bar and the tab bar. So I'm going to change the size, the height of this to 346. So it'll fit nicely in that area. Then we need to make sure we set the type of this to Books Tableview Controller, since the Tableview Controller is managing this table view. And then we're going to drag on the table view. So after you've got the table view in your view, what you want to do is set up the outlets that you created in the Tableview Controller. You need to make sure that the Books Table View is, before we do that, sorry, we got to open up the view so that we can see our table view, and we need to make sure that the view and the Books Table View both point to the UI Table View, like this. Once you've hooked that up, you can close this nib file, and you want to make sure that the nib is being loaded in the navigation correctly, the navigation controller correctly. You can do that by selecting the Tableview Controller and choosing the identity inspector, the attributes inspector, and selecting the nib name of Book Table View so that it loads it into the navigation view. Once you've done that, you should be able to switch back to Xcode and test it. Make sure everything's working correctly, and it is. We see our table view in here. It should be loading now. And now what we need to do is we need to add some data to our table view. So to do that, we need to implement our Datasource methods in our Tableview Controller. So I'm going to add just a simple array in the Tableview Controller to hold some data. We're going to call this the Books Array, and this is going to hold my favorite books, my favorite O'Reilly books. And in the Tableview Controller implementation file, the first thing we need to do is synthesize the array. Which means I need to jump back and make it a property, which I forgot to do. So we've got it synthesized, and then we'll jump down to the viewDidLoad method, uncomment that, and this is where I'm going to initialize my array. And I'm also going to set a title for my view, which will show up in the navigation bar. And I can do that by saying self.title equals ns localized string. And I'm just going to give it the title of books, and then we have to give it a description here. So I've set the title for the view, which, as I mentioned, will show up in the navigation bar. Now what I'm going to do is put some data into my array for the table view. So I'm going to create a temporary array. And give it 3 of my favorite O'Reilly books. And set the property, the Books Array property. And release the temporary array. Okay, so that has set up the data for my table view. Now what we need to do, of course, is come down here and edit the number of sections, the number of rows in section to return, or the number of elements in my array. And then once we've done that, we come down here to self a row at index path and actually set up the data for each row. So what I'm doing here is just grabbing the row from the index path, which is passed in, which gives us the row information, and then setting the text of the table cell that we're currently on to be the information, the data at that row in the books array. So we should be able to build and go now and see our data in the table view. And we do. It's great. So next, what we need to do is we need to build a view that will display the details of the books on our favorites list when I click on the title of one of my favorite books. So I'm going to build that view, and then I'm going to come back and look at how we use the navigation controller to display this view when you click on the title of a book. So I'm just going to keep this view really simple. I'm going to create a simple UI view controller class and hard code in a text view to show some simple data. So I'm going to create a new file, and it's going to be a UI view controller, and I'm going to call this the book detail view controller. And of course we need to create a nib file for this. So we create a new file, choose user interface, create a new view, nib file, and we're going to call this the book detail view. So we'll open up the detail view. We need to set the type of the class to the book detail view controller, and we need to hook up the view outlet to the view. Two things we need to do every time we create a new nib file. Then I'm going to, I think I'll drag on just a simple label for now, since this is just to show that we can put text on a view. And I'm going to put the book details go here. And once again, we can change the size of this to 411 since it's going to fit on top of the tab bar. Okay, so we're done with this, so we can close that, close this nib file, and we're going to jump back to Xcode. And in our table view controller, we need to add a reference to the detail view controller. So I'm going to add a class reference, and I'm going to add a property. And then finally, I'm going to jump back to the table view controller and update this file to be able to use this new detail view controller. So there's a couple things we need to do here. First, we're going to import the book detail view controller, and we're also going to import the delegate because we need the delegate in order to be able to access the navigation controller, because the delegate is what has the reference to the navigation controller. Then we need to remember to synthesize the book detail view controller property. And then we're going to jump down to the didSelectRowAtIndexPath method, which is the method that gets called when you tap on a row on the index view. And this is where we're going to add the code to create the book detail view and display it. And we're going to use the navigation controller to manage the display of that view controller by pushing the detail view controller onto the navigation controller stack, because that's how a navigation controller works. So I'll type in the code and then we'll step through it carefully. So first of all, grab the row, and I'm going to check to see if the book detail view controller equals null. Nil. And if it is, we're going to create a new one. This should be the class. I'm going to allocate a new one. Tell it the nib to load. And the bundle can be nil. Set our book detail view controller property to this new book detail view controller, and then of course we're going to release right here. Then we're going to set the title of the book detail view controller. Again, this will show up in the navigation bar at the top. And what I'm going to set it to is a string, which will be the title of the book, which is the title of the book in the row that we've currently selected. Next, what I need to do is get the navigation controller, and the way I can do that is, there's a couple of ways to do it, but the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to grab the navigation controller from the Delegate. So the standard way to grab the Delegate is to use this UI application, shared application, and then use the Delegate method to grab the Delegate. And then this is where the magic happens with the navigation controller. We're going to use the book's navigation controller property of the Delegate, and it's got a method called push view controller, and we pass it the book detail view controller, the view controller that we just created in the step above, and we're going to tell it to animate so it looks nice, and that's it. The view controller handles the rest for us. One more thing before we jump out of here, we need to make sure that we release the book detail view controller that we created as a property in the table view controller. So let's go through this again really quickly. The first thing we're going to do is grab the row from the index path of the currently selected row in the table view. We're going to create a detail of the book detail view controller and set the property in our table view controller to be that new book detail view controller. We're going to set the title of the book detail view controller, and then we're going to grab the Delegate from the UI application, and then grab the book's nav controller from the Delegate and use the navigation controller to push a book detail view controller on the navigation controller stack. And the way that the navigation controller works is it maintains a stack of views, and the view that's at the top of the stack is the one that is displayed. So when we first launch the application, the view that's being displayed is the table view. When we click on or tap on a row in the table view, that creates this new book detail view, which is then pushed on top of the stack, and the navigation controller then displays that new view. So that's it. Let's build and go and make sure we did all that correctly. And it works. When we click on the title of a book, it loads the detail view, and you can see here that it's displaying the title of the book in the navigation bar. So this is great, and we can look at our about, switch back and forth between tabs. So we now have a working tab bar navigation table view controller application on the iPhone.